For we contend not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual host of wickedness in the heavenly places. From the American Midwest comes This Present Darkness, where we explore the supernatural aspects of the paranormal from a Catholic perspective and expose the dark forces in our world and beyond, both seen and unseen. Now, here's your host, historian, paranormal investigator, author, and ghost lorist, Ursula Bielski.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Ursula Bielski, and this is This Present Darkness, and tonight is a very special night for two reasons. This is the first night that I'm actually recording the first episode that's going to be online, both in video format, the way that we've been doing for the past year, and also the first episode that I'm doing from scratch that's going to be on Buzzsprout, on the new podcast. So make sure that you guys who have been here with me, or actually on YouTube with me, whether you're on YouTube or Buzzsprout, make sure that you go back and check out. I have had a wonderful producer helping me to extract all of the audio from the entire Present Darkness series from last year. And we added a neat intro and outro that I hope you guys will like. And so now you can listen to all of those This Present Darkness episodes that we did via YouTube video last year. So if you're like me and you like to lie in bed at night and listen to paranormal, supernatural, or spiritual podcasts while you're falling asleep, you can do that. I hope you will add this show to your regular rotation along with Art Bell and all that other good stuff. Well, I know I can't hold a candle to Art Bell, but one can dream, right? Anyway, I'm so glad you're here with me tonight, because tonight we are starting a series within this series that I call The Devil in Dreamland. And The Devil in Dreamland is all about the occult, what I call origins and engines of the UFO enigma. About a year ago, I went fell far down the deep, dark rabbit hole of ufology research. And I was absolutely shocked at what I found. I'm going to be sharing with you a lot of the information that I have discovered in my ufology research, which is such a mess and such a chaotic and complex assortment of truth, lies, deception, mystery, and like I said, darkness, true darkness. We're going to be looking into how a lot of the UFO contactee reports and abduction reports began with occult activities like the use of Ouija boards and channeling. We're going to be looking at the involvement in the UFO enigma by people such as Aleister Crowley, Jack Parsons, a follower of Crowley who started the Jet Propulsion Lab out in Los Angeles, and his buddy L. Ron Hubbard, who started, of course, Scientology, one of the many UFO religions active in the world today. And we're going to be talking a lot about those religions. We're going to be talking a lot about the similarities between experiences with aliens, so-called alien spacecraft, and so-called aliens, and the experiences that people have been having for millennia with things like fairies and jinn and demons and angels and all sorts of other mysterious characters from the unseen realm. Tonight, I want to just talk to you a little bit about my own background with UFOs, going back to when I was a child, and then also what led me in recent years to begin really looking into the UFO enigma. As most of you guys probably know by now, I have spent my life as a researcher into ghosts and hauntings and other experiences like this with what we would call haunting activity or apparitions and things like that. And my interest in that began, as a lot of you also probably know, because I grew up in a house that we believed was classically haunted. My parents bought the house in 1967, a year after they were married. And it was a house that had been built by my great uncle, my mom's uncle, Andrew, who had helped to develop the north side township of Lakeview back around the turn of the 19th century. And our house was completed, I think, in 1903, somewhere around there. And by the time my parents moved into it, it was really run down. I mean, it was falling apart. Like the toilet on the second floor had fallen through the dining room ceiling into onto the first floor. So that's the kind of condition the house was in. So it wasn't really surprising to my parents when they found out that the house was known by neighbors and by the kids around to be haunted. In fact, the house was right across from St. Benedict Parish, from the convent where a lot of the sisters lived who taught at St. Benedict Elementary School, where I went to school and where my mom had taught when she first became a teacher in 1958. So, really not surprising that all the kids that were coming and going each day on that block would call this crumbling old house haunted. But sure enough, when my parents moved in, they realized there was more to this than just what the house looked like and a reputation that they'd gotten from stories among the kids. Because the very first night they stayed in the house, they were sleeping in the dining room on the first floor because the upstairs, as I already mentioned, was totally uninhabitable at this time. And they would have to spend many, many months fixing up the second floor so that it was livable. So they were sleeping in a bed that they had set up in the dining room off the kitchen on the second floor. And they woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps walking up the staircase from the foyer to the second floor, a few rooms away. Now, my dad was a police officer, and he reached for his service revolver on the nightstand and went through the house to find this intruder. The house had been empty for some time after the previous owner had passed away. There was an elderly brother and sister who had lived in the house, which we only found out later. But the house had been standing empty. So my dad assumed that there was a squatter in the house because no one was living in it up until then. He went through every single room from attic to basement. Nothing, no one was there. Nothing was disturbed. None of the doors or windows were unlocked. He said he had had a lot of these experiences as a cop in Chicago where people swore up and down the block that they had seen people in their house, heard people in their house, doors opening and closing, footsteps, all of that. And he said he just came to accept that it was ghosts and just told people, call us if anything else happens. He told my mom that night, it's spooks, go back to bed. And that's what he always told us when we were growing up. My brother and I are a year apart. And I remember some of my earliest memories were of hearing those footsteps on the stairs in the middle of the night. And certainly that is why I developed such a keen interest in the supernatural from a young age, trying to understand what was going on in my own home. At that time, I did not have any experiences as a child with UFOs. I do remember fondly when all my cousins, I had 6 cousins, my Aunt Lou's children, and in the summertime, they would often come and all stay over for weeks at a time at my grandma's house a couple of blocks away. And so my brother and I would go over and hang out with them during the day and often stay into the evening. And we'd all, in the age before the internet and video games and all that, we would all gather on the back porch above the backyard at night and tell ghost stories. And my older cousins would tell us scary stories about when they went to Boy Scout camp and stuff like that, and tell us all kinds of urban legends. And we would also look for UFOs because one of my grandmother's neighbors had some time before that claimed to have seen a UFO in the sky over the backyards there on Kyler Avenue here on the north side. So we would all be looking up at the skies at night, my cousins and me. So I do remember that fondly, but never saw anything. And it wasn't until just a few years ago when my family and I, my husband and our daughters were driving to the Great Smoky Mountains for vacation. We were driving through Indiana and we saw strange lights in the sky, and they were moving in ways that it seemed airplanes shouldn't be moving. But, it wasn't that striking, and it didn't really have that big of an effect on any of us. And I haven't really thought about it much until very recently when I started thinking about UFOs again. So that was my experience growing up. Our house was haunted. We would hear these footsteps. I would often sometimes also come home from school when I was older. My mom was a school teacher, so she'd be working. My dad also had part-time jobs after he retired from the police department. And so sometimes I would come home from school and I'd be a latchkey kid, and I'd be home by myself. And a lot of days I would come in and I'd have no problem. I wouldn't think twice about it. I'd go up to my room. I'd go down to the basement and do laundry, all that kinds of stuff. And I didn't think twice about being alone. There were other days where I would come home from school and I'd be alone in the house and I was absolutely paralyzed with fear. And it was just inexplicable. It was totally random. I never knew when that was going to happen. And I found out later that other family members also had those experiences, but they never told me that they did. I never, I had dreams when I was a girl. I had nightmares in the house. And I also had night terrors at times where I would wake up, like shaking and in a cold sweat, not remembering what I had dreamed, but being absolutely terrified and unable to move. And I also had a lot of experiences with sleep paralysis where I would wake up and I couldn't move. I couldn't cry out for my mother. I couldn't say anything. And I would just be held in that state for many minutes before I was somehow released from it. During these years, my brother, he didn't have nightmares the way that I did, but he was having other kinds of what he called dreams. And these were dreams that aliens would arrive in a spacecraft behind our house, and that these alien beings would come into his room at night. And sometimes they would take him away on the spacecraft. He would be absolutely terrified by these dreams. And that's what they were always called in my house. My mom referred to them as those. I don't think my dad even knew about them. I don't know if my mom ever thought they were anything else or if my brother did. He did develop a lifelong interest in UFOs and aliens. But, and at that time, it was pretty common knowledge, at least around the United States, that there had been a lot of people who, or at least some people, who had had these contactee or abduction experiences. People like Betty and Barney Hill, famously, Travis Walton, the subject of the Fire in the Sky movie, Whitley Strieber, who wrote the infamous best-selling book Communion, which talked about his experience with aliens in, I believe it was upstate New York. But that was never brought into the conversation at our house when my brother was having these dreams. So they were always just described as dreams. We accepted them as dreams. And I didn't question that again until many, many years later. In fact, just the last few years. And I began to question what happened in that house growing up after my mother passed away. And that was in 2018. Now, years before that, in 1986, after my dad passed away, we had another eruption of phenomena in the house. That first round that we experienced when we were growing up seemed to kind of peter out and then disappear completely in the early 1980s. And then for several years, things were very quiet in the house. And then after my dad passed away in 1986, all hell broke loose in the house. And my dad, as some of you know, was an identical twin. And at the age of 72, his twin brother was fixing a window of an apartment building his girlfriend owned down on Erie Street here in Chicago. And he was on the 4th floor and he fell out of this 4th floor window. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. My dad, interestingly, knew that he was dead before he got to the hospital, even though the doctors denied it for several hours. But my dad always had those kinds of experiences with the supernatural. He's claimed always that when he was 12 years old, he saw the devil at his family's house on Giddings Street here in Chicago. He said that during World War II in France, he was having dinner with a farm family. He and another one of the soldiers that he was on duty with, and a Bigfoot reached in through the window and stole some food that was on a table next to the window. He had a lot of other experiences like this throughout his life. So it was something that I always kind of accepted, that my dad accepted. And he was influential on me too, growing up. He would always take me to cemeteries and tell me the ghost stories about different neighborhoods in Chicago where he had worked as a police officer and where he had lived with his Polish immigrant family. So my dad was another big influence on my interest in the supernatural. But again, we didn't really talk much about this growing up, but certainly in December of that year, my uncle died in July of 1986. And then in December, my dad stumbled and fell against an old iron radiator. And he thought he was okay, thought he had bruised his ribs, but he ended up having cracked several of his ribs, and one of the ribs ended up puncturing his lung. He was in intensive care for several days, but right before that, and then passed away in the hospital. But right before that accident, out of the blue, he was in perfect health. He told me one day, I'm going to die, and I just want you to know it's okay. And I just brushed it off and thought, he was grieving because my uncle had died. And I said, you're healthy. There's nothing wrong with you. You're only 72 years old. You're fine. Stop talking nonsense. And then that night, I was at school at the time. I had started college at Benedictine University in Lisle. My brother was there too. So we had gone back to school after the weekend. And that night, my mom and dad were watching television at the house here in Chicago on Bell Avenue. And he turned to my mom and he said, my brother's at the door. And my mom said, your brother's dead. And he said, no, he's at the door. He's pounding on the window and he's come to get me. And he kept insisting on this to the point where my mom had to get up and go to the door to prove to my dad that his dead brother wasn't there. And sure enough, a few days later, my dad was dead. So fast forward a couple of months after that, as I said, sort of all hell broke loose in the house, where we were hearing footsteps, we were hearing banging in the basement, we were hearing things like disembodied music. There was music that my brother heard coming from an electronic piano that I had under my bed in my bedroom that had no batteries in it. And he heard it playing one day when he came home from school. And there was no one else in the house. There was another night where my brother had been at a sportsman's club meeting. He belonged to a shooting club. And he came home about 11 o'clock at night, and he was cleaning his rifle in the living room when all of a sudden this banging started on the back door, the kitchen door. This was an interior kitchen door that led to the enclosed back porch. And there was glass in the door. And he could see clearly there was no one at the door, but he could see the door moving, thundering, rumbling from this banging on the door. And he said he was so scared, he loaded this rifle that he was cleaning, and he was kneeling on the floor in the living room with the rifle barrel pointed through the dining room and the kitchen to the kitchen door, just waiting for whatever this was to come in. And then it abruptly stopped about 15 minutes later that this went on. And all of this time, my mother and I were fast asleep upstairs. We didn't hear anything. We didn't wake up, nothing. After 2 months of this, even my skeptical mother became convinced that there was something wrong here and that perhaps my dad was having trouble moving on, on the other side. And so she let me call our rectory. And I talked to a priest. It was actually a young priest who had just been ordained that summer. And I said, can you come over and help us? And I said, I'm so embarrassed to even ask you this. And he said, don't be embarrassed. It happens a lot more than you would imagine. So even this young priest who had just been ordained had already had experiences with helping families with things like this in our parish here in Chicago. So he came over for dinner that Friday night, and my aunt and my uncle came over as well. And we were all sitting in the dining room having dinner. And after dinner, he was going to go through the house and bless each room. There's a specific prayer for each room of a house blessing. And it's like a minor exorcism as well. So as well as, praying for the souls of the dead, it's also like an exorcism that rids the house of any evil spirits that might be there. And, we actually had to interrupt the dinner and do the house blessing before dinner was over because we heard it sounded like someone was running up and down the hallway upstairs. So after that night, after the house blessing, everything was quiet in the house again. And nothing else happened until after my mom passed away in the summer of 2018. And I was over there soon after her death, like a couple of days after her death, because even though my mom had left in her trust, in her will, she had specified that my family could live in the house after her death, but the trustee fought me about this and told me immediately after her death that the house would have to be sold. Well, that was a long story and a lot of tribulation and trial that came after that. But, I had this thought in my head that, oh my gosh, we're going to have to lose the house. And I was sitting here in my apartment and I was thinking, I couldn't think about my mom's house that had been in our family for 50 years and that was so lovingly cared for, and decorated with all of her knickknacks and all of her cozy things. I couldn't stand the thought that it was going to be gone and all of her things were going to be gone. And I went over to the house and I started taking everything down. I couldn't stand. I was like, if this is going to be gone, I want it to be gone now. So I went over and I started taking all the pictures and the knickknacks down and packing them up for an estate sale or whatever was going to happen to them. And it was so odd because I was talking to my mom and I was the only one in the house. And I was talking to her and I was crying. And I told her, because I knew there was funny business going on with trustee. And I had warned her about it. And I said, this house is going to be gone. You have no idea what's been going on. You've been getting ripped off. You need to stop this. You need to do something. You need to protect yourself, protect the house. And she just wouldn't listen to me. And I was talking to her. So this day, a couple of days after her death, I was taking down her stuff and I was talking to her, I hope you're happy now. I told you this was going to happen. I told you the house was going to be lost. I hope you're happy now. And then all of a sudden, all alone in the house, 2 rooms away, I hear this huge crash and I'm terrified. And I go to investigate. And here's what had happened. My mom kept her microwave oven on the back porch, the enclosed back porch. And she would go out there and heat up her tea or heat up her oatmeal in the morning. And the 1.5 inch thick glass door on the microwave had burst into, imploded into a million pieces. No one in the house. This is something that helped me later on because the Catholic Church tells us we should not talk to spirits under any circumstances. We should not even, say hi to our parents who have passed away, talk to them, ask them for help. We always have to go through the mediator or the co-mediators. We have to go through Jesus, God, or we can also go through the Blessed Mother or one of the saints. And we can say, you know what, could you pray for me and ask God and help Jesus to help me? Because you got Paul, basically. But we should never ourselves address people who have passed away because that opens the door for the demonic to answer us and to pretend to be our loved ones who have passed away. And I learned this lesson the hard way. And I found out after my mom's funeral that my husband and our elder daughter, who had been living in the house taking care of my mom in her last days, actually up to the last week of her life, when we were kind of told we weren't needed anymore. And then she ended up dead not long after because she'd been left alone. I found out that they had in those first days after my mom's death, they had their own experiences in the house, hearing footsteps, hearing noises in my mom's bedroom and the bedrooms upstairs. My husband was in the house alone one day and he saw the bathroom door open by itself right in front of his eyes. I was so disturbed by this that I contacted my friend Ralph Sarchi, who you guys probably have heard of. If you don't know his name, you've probably seen the movie Deliver Us from Evil. Fantastic movie about possession and exorcism, Hollywood film, but it's based on the life of Ralph Sarchi, who is a former New York City police sergeant. And he's also a demonologist who became interested and involved in the supernatural and in demonology because of things that happened to him on his job. So he wrote a book called Deliver Us from Evil, and that's what the film is based on. But over these years now, Ralph has become a demonologist. He knows so much about the way that demons work and about what makes them leave. He's Catholic. He's a Sedevacantist, which is kind of like a schismatic faction of the Catholic Church. They'll tell you that they're the actual Catholic Church. And I know there's a lot of days where I wonder just that. And we'll talk about Sedevacantism later. But in general, it's a faction of Catholics who believe that the papacy has been empty since Vatican II, essentially, and that we have not had a legitimate pope since then. So it's very interesting. But of course, they're very traditional Catholics. I went to Ralph because I was really worried that my mom was somehow stuck in the house for some reason. And I told him what had been going on, what I had experienced with the microwave and what my husband and our daughter had experienced. And then I told him, other things that had gone on in the house, like after my dad passed away in 1986, that we had to call the priest in because of those things that, because we thought my dad was stuck in the house. And I told him about when I had grown up there and we thought the house was haunted and the kinds of experiences that we had there. And he just flat out said to me, "That's not your mother. That wasn't your father. And your house wasn't haunted when you were growing up." And we went on to talk for quite some time about when you have these kinds of experiences that take place after someone passes away, it is highly unlikely that it is the spirit of that person. It is much more likely that it is a demonic entity that is attempting to convince you that it is the spirit of your loved one, to engage you with them, to try and get you to communicate with them, hopefully maybe hold a seance, have a medium come in, start using, ghost boxes and things like that, Ouija boards. These are all things that the demonic love, because they love us to come into conversation with them so that they can gain control over us and use us and hopefully get our souls eventually. So after I hung up the phone with Ralph, the wheels really started turning in my mind as I went back through my life and started to recall everything that had happened in that house growing up. And in particular, I kept coming back to those dreams that my brother had when we were children, those dreams that a spaceship had come to our house and that alien beings had come into his room and taken him away on numerous occasions. And then something else happened that really woke me up. In March of 2020, just like everyone else, my life, our family, my career was turned completely upside down by the pandemic. On March 13th, 2020, like every other business in the state of Illinois, our ghost tour business was shut down by Governor Pritzker. And that was it. I mean, in the rest of the year, there were some weeks where we were able to open on a limited basis, allowed to do that and have maybe a third of the people on the bus. And then we'd be shut down again when another wave came through of the pandemic of COVID-19. And it became impossible for us, to function. And I ended up selling the name of the company and the website to a colleague of mine. And that's worked out well so far. But, kind of lost everything. I lost my business and I lost contact with everybody. And just like everyone else, I could no longer see people in public. I couldn't see my family. I couldn't see my neighbors. I couldn't see my friends. I couldn't have events. I was doing all sorts of paranormal events. I was hosting tours. And suddenly it was all gone. And I was not only just lonely, and I was scared, but I felt such a loss being cut off from, my colleagues and the, research into the paranormal with other people that were like-minded. And so I was so excited later in the year. Actually, I think it was maybe in the spring of 2021 that I got an email that there was going to be an online UFO seminar this upcoming weekend. And I was like, oh, UFOs, it's not really like my thing. I would rather that it was a conference on, ghosts or demons or something. But I was like, okay, well, that sounds good. And so I was like, I'll sign up for this and I'll have a couple of days, even though it's online, I'll be able to talk to people that are into the paranormal. I'll learn something about UFOs finally. And, UFOs just didn't seem very supernatural to me or paranormal to me. It seemed like, oh, these are probably people from another, beings from another planet. And for some reason, they're elusive right now. And maybe I'll find out a little bit more about where they're from, how they behave, why they're being so elusive, what their spacecrafts are made of, how their spacecrafts work, and what some of the theories are about these objects, and these actual beings from other planets. So I thought this was all very, scientific, like parascientific, and this was something that is going to be revealed as natural and scientific down the line, right? But I was just grateful for an opportunity to talk with and be with some like-minded people. So bright and early Saturday morning, I'm at my computer with my cup of coffee and I'm ready to go for this conference on spacecraft and people from other planets. And then not 2 hours into this event, I realize that the UFO phenomenon is so much more supernatural and so much more occult related and occult grounded than anything I have ever studied in 30 plus years in the fields of ghosts and hauntings. And that seems to be so much closer to the experiences and the phenomena of what I have always studied and understood as demonology. I took some furious notes that day during this conference, and I still have them. I mean, I've had them right next to me for all this time. And I was just astounded that person after person after person who was giving their memories of being what they call an experiencer, someone who experiences seeing UFOs or being visited by aliens or abducted by aliens. These experiencers all shared so many similar experiences, and so many of them were dark, malevolent, treacherous experiences that they somehow were evaluating as positive experiences, which is one of the strangest and most disturbing things about this entire enigma, which is that the way that experiencers and observers of these phenomena have come to the conclusion that somehow these beings are more highly evolved than us, more morally superior than us, and somehow mean to do us good, because none of the evidence backs that up. And I mean, none of it. Some of the things that I made notes about were the fact that a lot of these experiencers, the experiences began with like haunting phenomena or poltergeist phenomena, knocks on the walls, scratching on the walls, footsteps, the sounds of doors opening and closing. And they developed into the experience of being visited in the bedrooms of the experiencers by these aliens, usually what they describe as the grays, these small, like 3 or 4 foot tall aliens with gray skin, the big eyes. You know what I'm talking about. Something very common in a lot of these experiences is the fact that they start with visitations by these so-called aliens in the bedroom, and then they lead into abduction experiences. So there's like a warming up period. And this was similar to what my brother experienced in his so-called dreams when we were growing up. And a lot of these reports that I was hearing too in this online conference, the experiencers talked about that the ones that were married, that were sleeping with their spouses, after some time went on and several of these contactee experiences had happened, before the abduction could happen, the experiencer, the contactee, had to be separated from their spouse. And the aliens would convince the contactee to have their spouse go and sleep in another room. And after a few nights of that, the abduction would happen. Finally, the abduction would happen. But the abductions would start with, believe it or not, sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis, like I had been experiencing when my brother was having his alien nightmares, as we called them, when we were kids. I don't know, and I kind of estranged from my brother now, so I don't know. We never talked about it. I don't know if I was experiencing my sleep paralysis on the same nights that he was having his dreams or not, but I know that those dreams were frequent, and I know that my sleep paralysis was frequent. So here I was listening to this, watching this online conference and hearing and watching these experiencers, one after the other, talk about how they had been visited by aliens, how the aliens had separated them from their loved ones, and how their spouses or their brothers or sisters or a parent sleeping in another room would experience sleep paralysis and be literally held down in their own beds by an unseen force or by visual aliens that they were seeing themselves, so that they could not go into the room where the person was having the contactee or abduction experience. This online conference really opened my eyes, and I started to deeply think about things that I had experienced growing up in that house on Bell Avenue here in Chicago, and what my family had experienced as well, in particular what my brother had experienced. And I began to realize and question, was I an unwitting accomplice in repeated abductions of my brother by these beings, whatever they are? And that's what sent me down the deep, dark rabbit hole of ufology. Now, that deep, dark rabbit hole is serious business. And just a few days of research into ufology will drive it home to you that you are dealing with something that just may be a bad idea for you to be dealing with. As I already mentioned, I discovered in that first online conference just how occult related the ufology experience is, the UFO enigma is. I realized that a lot of it has its origins in the practice of the occult and traditional methods of occult practice that people have used for millennia to contact spirits and demons and, magical powers and forces. And I realized, that it's also the engine, as I call it, of what keeps it going. People being drawn into the practice of the occult because they have an experience. And it's only through using occult practices that they continue to have these experiences, which they desire to have, and that they intensify the experiences, which they desire to do. And all of this has screamed to me over and over. It's the same with ghost hunting. It's the same with demonology. It's the same with infestation and obsession and possession in demonology. And so I began to look at the people, the events, and the history, and the ongoing enigma of the UFO phenomenon, which has been a part of our culture now for at least 75 years. And as you'll see in the future on the show, if you don't already know, that it's something much older than we're giving it credit for, or that most of us are giving it credit for. So I hope that you will join me. Just show up for the show every week, because a lot of the episodes are going to be on this Devil in Dreamland topic over the spring and summer. And it will also be interspersed with other topics. We're going to be talking about the 3 days of darkness coming up, something very important for all of us to know about. We're going to be talking about saints who lost their heads, literally, another pet project of mine. We're going to be talking about, all sorts of things. We're going to be talking about more extreme hauntings coming up, including the case of the so-called Dalby spook on the Isle of Man that was investigated by Harry Price, that included allegedly a talking mongoose, which is a very disturbing case. That's usually just dismissed as silly and ridiculous and absurd. But that absurdity is something that we will see in the study of ufology that seems to be part of the plan. The great ufologist Jacques Vallée figured this out a long time ago, believing that the experiences of UFOs contain this absurdity on purpose, because whatever these entities are, they want us to sound crazy. And they've done a really good job of that. So I will see you next week when we continue to, or when we really start diving into the reality of the devil in Dreamland. And incidentally, Dreamland refers to, if you don't know anything about ufology, Dreamland is one of the many nicknames for Area 51 out in the Nevada desert, which is part of Nellis Air Force Base and one of the most secretive military compounds in the world, where, according to many alleged eyewitnesses, we have been reverse engineering alien spacecraft for many years now. So Dreamland refers to that, and The Devil in Dreamland is all about how the occult has gotten so deeply involved in, and maybe even was the beginning of, the UFO enigma. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please go ahead and like the episode, comment on it, and please share it everywhere and invite like-minded people to come over and check it out. You can always see the video version of our podcast on the YouTube channel, Ursula Bielski's World of the Supernatural, and head on over to worldofsupernatural.com. Sign up for our newsletter to find out everything that's going on coming up, including live stream events, new stuff on the blog, new stuff on the channel, and everything else. And make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel as well to get all of the latest from the world of the supernatural. Thanks for being here tonight, and remember to pray for ghosts. I'm Ursula Bielski.
Thanks for listening to This Present Darkness. The video version of this podcast is available on Ursula Bielski's World of the Supernatural YouTube channel. Be sure to become a subscriber by signing up with Buzzsprout today. And remember to sign up for the World of the Supernatural mailing list at worldofthesupernatural.com for our monthly newsletter and more. And don't forget to support the podcast through Patreon.